Welcome to Motivated to Lead podcast, helping you become a better leader. I'm your host, Mark Klein. Hi everyone, Mark Klein with SEMA Partners. Glad you could join us again this week for our podcast. We're going to revisit some conversations we've had in the past with the focus on the question, what I wish I knew when I was 22. We all wish we knew back when we were younger what we know now, and these 6 leaders will share their thoughts around things that they wish they would have known, and hope you enjoy the conversations.
I would say don't be so sure of yourself in terms of what you think you're on earth to do. Because I was arrogant enough to say that at 22, my goal is to be a college president at age 35, and I succeeded at 34. And as I look back on that, that was a stupid statement because I learned a lot from that experience, but I really wasn't emotionally prepared. I was mentally prepared, but not emotionally prepared for that amount of pressure, just because I hadn't had the experience to justify that. So I was type A, gung-ho, go-getter, always had to prove myself. I had a friend who's a Christian psychologist, and he said, why do you feel you have to succeed? And I said, to prove all those naysayers wrong. And they said, so what happens if you do fail? And I said, well, I can't fail. And they said, you will fail at something. You failed at different things. You failed at different things in life. Did it kill you? And I said, no. Did it make you bitter? And I said, not really. I said, I was disappointed, but I learned from it. And he said, well, there you go. So it's not going to kill you. It's a learning experience. It may be God's way of telling you to slow down and reflect and learn and then go forward. So I would tell my 22-year-old self, take a deep breath, learn to walk before you run and savor each experience. And don't be so crass to say, this is what I'm going to do and this is where I'm going to end up, because your life experience, like the mosaic, is one little piece at a time. And you have to put all those pieces on a canvas to make sure that and then take a step back 10 feet and say, wow, that's a beautiful mosaic.
I'd give her the advice, which is to focus initially on the people for whom you're working with and the people with whom you are working. Because I think in your early years, it's all about getting as many experiences as you can. So I would not focus on the amount of money I'm making or whether this is a city I want to live in for the rest of my life. But I would say or even the product line. I don't think it's as important if you went to General Mills, if you work on Cheerios or Yoplait. What I do think is important is, do you feel like you're working for people from whom you can really learn? That to me would be the best advice.
I often think about this because I have 3 boys in their 20s. So this is frequently the case. So there's a couple of things I've passed on to them, which in a sense will answer your question. And it has to do with balance. And it's what I've learned over the years, which is, and I learned it in my 20s, which is, I'd say point 1, perfection is often the enemy of the good. And that in the elusive quest to try to get that last 5%, you might take the 95% and squander an opportunity because you waited too long. The second thing would be that it's obviously a balance between people orientation and results orientation, and that both are critically important, and you can't err on the side of just being focused on results without the people, and you can't focus exclusively on the people elements without driving towards the results. And I'd say that maybe one other point is having a really good tolerance for ambiguity and recognizing that you don't have all the information that you may need to have as you may move along. And the fourth thing is something I've learned along the way is what I call accurate empathy. Accurate self-assessment. accurate empathy is actually a fifth one, but accurate self-assessment is the ability to try to see yourself as others see you in situations. And when you're driving home from a meeting, try to debrief on what did I do well, what could I have done differently, and essentially almost becoming a self-learning computer. And actually, I learned a lot of these things because a lot of the thesis work I did in my graduate program was based on executive development and what are the things that made people move to the top. And I began to incorporate those things into my toolkit, if you will, in my 20s, and they really served me well.
It's don't be hesitant to get going. I think that it's really, and sometimes I remember back early in my career, I sort of paused before taking action on stuff that I knew was actionable. And I think that in hindsight, things would have been much better off taking early action. And knowing full well that you might not have the perfect answer, but if you're experimental and alert to the signals, you'll always be able to change course. Mm. And so I think get going, number one. Don't be afraid to start.
Great question. I think if I was talking to a 22-year-old me, I would say a couple of things. One is make sure that the basics that you have learned through your upbringing, whatever is important to you, you hold firm to that. And in my case, high integrity, ethics, those kinds of things. But the other thing I would suggest is that work hard and focus on what's in front of you. I think so many times we try to think way ahead, and where is this getting me and all that. I would tell myself, just focus on what you're doing, do it with excellence, work hard, and the rest of it takes care of itself.
I would try to kick myself in the pants and listen more and speak less, because you learn a lot in listening. I would emphasize what I still feel today and what I originally mentioned about the culture at GE, that don't overthink it. Be execution focused. Unless you want to be a consultant, which is a fine profession, if you're going to be in the pit and a doer, you're never going to have perfect information. You've got to deal with ambiguity. And as I mentioned, if you pull the trigger and you miss, learn quickly. And I think tied to that, if you make a mistake, admit it, don't pass the buck. And I found that tends to quell finger pointers very quickly. If you say, I goofed, but here's what I'm going to do about it, or here's the remediation to that. You don't beat a dead horse, you move on. And I find that to be refreshing in people, to have a certain self-awareness, to say, hey, I'm better at this and not good at that. And so I'd say listen more, speak less, focus on execution, and admit when you're wrong.
Thank you for listening to the Motivated to Lead podcast. Please subscribe on iTunes. You can also see a video version of this interview at motivatedtolead.com. This podcast is brought to you by SEMA Partners, helping you find your next great leader.